My question is regarding Turkey and what you said about grouping it with the neighbors such as Russia. How can you expect Turkey to take accession seriously regarding the political and economic and judicial reforms required when you're going to relegate them to a group that includes Russia?
Perfectly shows the major obstacles ahead of us regarding closer cooperation, if not integration, with Turkey. So far, Turkey is addressed through the enlargement cluster. So it is a candidate country. It has fulfilled all the conditions that the EU asked to be this candidate, and now it is entering negotiations for being one day an EU country. But, and it's a big but, what we know is that several countries are clearly against Turkish accession to the EU. For many, many reasons. For economic reasons, because let's say first there is a question of absorption capacity. If Turkey enters the EU, it will in a way disbalance drastically the internal equilibrium within the EU. That does not mean that we cannot deal with that. We can, but we would have to rethink many, many different rules internally and policies. For instance, just one example, economically, the EU has what is called cohesion funds to try to give money to the poor regions of Europe to make sure that there is a certain solidarity and equilibrium between of wealth, economic welfare, etc., between these various regions, the poor regions. If Turkey enters, given the level of growth and economic development within Turkey, it will take all the funds from all the 27 national countries. So we would have to completely revise the way that we distribute these funds. In terms of policy decision, we would have a country, for instance, which the European Parliament would have to be completely revised because it would be the most populated country. So many, many countries would have much less MEPs elected to the European Parliament, and so forth and so on. So it's a question of absorption capacity. And there is a condition in the negotiation of enlargement which say Turkey can do whatever it wants, it's super, but if the EU cannot manage to absorb Turkey internally, the EU would have to find the best, the closest cooperation with Turkey. So it's a kind of second-rank status, which does not exist within the EU. Either you're a member state or not. There is no half member states. So these countries who do not want Turkey to enter have already started to propose strategic partnerships with Turkey on certain issues. But Turkey is completely refusing any talks on any matters which are not within the realm of the enlargement process. The problem is the EU is a law and administrative-based organization. So there is a lot of rules, treaty rules to respect, etc. Negotiations of enlargement are proceeding chapter after chapter. You open a chapter when you have finalized a chapter. Today we are at chapter 10, and EU member states refuse to open further chapters because Turkey is not, for instance, recognizing Cyprus, which is a member state of the EU, and many other issues. So what's happening? Energy issues is an upcoming chapter. Turkey, so the EU is not really discussing energy with Turkey, but Turkey will play, increasingly, is already playing, a major role as a transit country for energy to the EU. If you're discussing the southern corridor, the Nabucco pipeline, to bring gas from the Caspian to the EU, you need Turkey. Another aspect, foreign policy. If you're discussing promoting democracy, supporting civil society in the Middle East, you need Turkey. If you want to settle, which is almost impossible at the moment, but if you want to make progress on the Syrian front, you need Turkey. But the problem is that the EU cannot discuss these issues with Turkey because it has not opened these chapters. So there is a gap, a big gap. And this is not strategic at all to act as such. So what we propose is that in parallel with enlargement negotiations, the ability to discuss concrete issues and to develop common joint collective actions with Turkey on other fronts. And at the moment, it's impossible because Turkey is saying, no, I'm not discussing anything outside enlargement, and the EU is saying the same, no, we are not discussing further, we will not discuss these issues through the enlargement process because that will mean opening other chapters. So your question is very good because yes, if you just put Turkey as it is and you put it with Russia and others, it's a very less advanced status than the one on enlargement. So for this to occur, you need both to make progress on the enlargement process without prejudging the end, the final decision to be adopted. Once you decide to open negotiations, you have to go to the end of the negotiation, then you take a decision. So that's this combined approach that we're proposing.
Thank you for your presentation. It's a huge area. It's so hard to summarize all these aspects, and you just did it perfectly, so thank you again. My question was different, but before that, I want to say a few things about Turkey, and you're so right, you're touching that absorption capacity of the EU, but when, I'm a Turkish citizen, by the way, thank you, and I see it in a little bit different way, because when we talk about in Turkey, absorption capacity of the EU, we usually refer to the institutions and the Turkish, how Turkey can imbalance the European current balance between among member states. But when you talk about economic issues, I think it will be I'm not an economist or I'm not an expert, but when I look at the recent situation, I think Turkey will be contributing if it becomes a member, and also for the migration nightmare which EU member states are thinking recently when Turkey joins the EU. I think it is kind of exaggerated issue. I don't think that, because we are accepting migrants from European countries, especially young people recently. I don't know, these are just the popular discourse right now, so I just wanted to share it with you. What I heard from you during your presentation is you're saying that EU is focusing on a regional approach rather than nation basis approach through its European neighborhood policy, and it's aware of the international environment which is so challenging recently. So I see that rather than being idealistic, EU is becoming more realistic recently. And I think one phase in the EU's life has been fulfilled, which was establishing the Union. So I think it entered another phase, the Union, and it became to create concrete policies regarding its foreign external relations. But there is a missing point, I guess, when people criticizing EU, because the thing is, EU is not a nation state. So when we criticize the Union, we have to take into consideration that it cannot make policy, foreign policy, as a nation state. So there should be some different mechanism, and I think this mechanism is missing when we talk about EU's external relations, foreign policy issues. The debate, the conflict between member states as well as between institutions is a kind of this mechanism. And when we talk about regional organizations, policy making, which EU will be the first, I guess, in the world, because it is the more, it is a union, it is more different, a unique organization. It just becomes a model creating this. So I think there is this progress, as you said, and it's becoming slow because it is not a traditional way of policy making, foreign policy making, and I think, yeah. What do you think about this? So this is, I want to talk about it.
Turkey is both a concern and a challenge. Let's take migration. It's a concern because it's first a huge country which has immense borders with many countries which are at least at that time very insecure. So this is a concern. On the other hand, it's a challenge, an opportunity. If you cooperate much more with Turkey on these border migration issues, you are able to be part of this management of borders. So to fight illegal migration, smuggling, and many other threats for internal security, let's say. So it's both a challenge and a concern. With regards, in terms of absorption capacity, it is not only institution, it is really all aspects, because the EU is not only an institution, it's an economic area. But it's clearly a political condition. I mean, you can adapt everything. It's just about allowing the conditions for any country to enter. But it might disbalance. At the time we were discussing whether Russia should one day enter the EU. But what is important to understand anyway from an EU perspective, it is very different to integrate Turkey, such a big country, compared to there is no comparison in the past of such enlargement. All the countries that have been integrated within the EU were small countries or middle countries. So the scale of the challenge is completely different. But I believe that we can manage with this challenge. Regarding the mechanism, the conflicts between member states, how to deal with it, etc. That's true that the European Union is a unique process of regional integration, but which has mainly based on economic policies, and then other policies, but internally. And this is reflected in the way that it acts abroad. It has not been capable to use the same internal mechanisms it had developed internally to act abroad, which is mainly the community method with a set of different institutions cooperating together. On the foreign policy front, it's totally different, it's intergovernmental, but the new set of institutions that we have now are supposedly to fill the gap between these divides. But then, as you mentioned, it's not a nation state, so it will take a lot of time to progressively adapt and develop. And finally, the European Union, and I say that because we have just published a new book at Notre Europe, which is about the federation of nation states, which is the concept of the European Union. It's not federalism, it's not just an addition of countries, it's a federation of nation states. So the legitimacy comes from both the nations and their citizens.
What are the lessons of the intervention, the use of force in Libya? France and the UK went to war in Libya, and the institutions of Brussels were completely absent. The EU was not present. One, the Brits made it clear that they considered the EU defense structures to be paralytic and inducing paralysis. They were not going to risk the lives of their troops working through that kind of a mechanism. Two, the most important country on the continent was flatly opposed, Germany, who simply didn't want to have anything to do with it. Three, the Italian prime minister said he really agreed with the Germans, but only made his bases available and participated because NATO was going to be the instrument and not the European Union. Even neutral Sweden sent 6 fighter bombers on condition that it be done through NATO and not through the EU. So you have to think about the implications of this for everything, for the internal structure of the UN, the reforms that you were alluding to, which could be very useful for some purposes, that is the external service being created under the High Representative. I think they're almost irrelevant. They wouldn't be in any. They wouldn't have any effect. They wouldn't be involved in resolving this problem. So this sheds a powerful, a bright light on the problems that are confronting the European Union. And for example, in this report on transatlantic relations, I mean, these are pious hopes, hoping that the United States would take the European Union seriously. If you have this kind of decision-making mechanism, it's not going to happen.
Yeah. No, there are many lessons from the Libyan crisis and intervention. Some are bad, others are better, depending on how we look at them. First, that's right, it was not an EU intervention. It was a UN, let's say a NATO-backed, NATO Arab League backed by a UN mandate with EU countries participating in this. It was not...
The UN didn't take the initiative. This was simply pressure of the French. Well, not sorry.
But there was a mandate, you're right.
And very ambiguous.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is one of the first main lessons, is that the implications for the Syrian crisis has been, of this mandate and the way that it has been used, has been disastrous. But anyway, it has allowed some countries to intervene in Libya. So the first implication is that I think from an EU perspective for EU countries, no such intervention is possible at all without a UN mandate. And the second one, which is I think a good one, which has been also a strong condition pushed by the UK and the French, is that, let's say, the NATO coalition should not act alone. On the contrary, it has to involve countries, Arab countries, and these were many from the Gulf. So that means broader coalitions and not the West against the rest. This is the broad message. These messages, I think, were pushed by EU countries. This is a good thing. Then, regarding the internal EU cuisine, for sure there is bad implications. Bad implications because it reflects the state of the debate regarding the EU defense. A debate which is mainly, there is a complete heterogeneity of views within the EU, and for completely different reasons from one country to the other, many countries are opposing the creation of what would be a kind of EU military system, a real EU defense. Recently, there has been an interesting report published by made by the High Representative, Cathy Ashton, making some proposals on the defense integration. And one of those was a EU headquarters, their own military headquarters. And the UK directly refused because they do not want to either duplicate or act outside the realm of NATO, trying to remain the strategic one vis-à-vis the US. So directly, Cathy Ashton, what she did, she has put it into the bin without taking the good proposals on other fronts. And certain countries, such as France, has pushed to have to continue the debate on certain fronts. So why I say that? Because again, Germany has strongly, at the beginning, opposed the position of a majority of EU member states, saying that we should intervene in Libya. At the beginning, the German Foreign Ministry wanted to oppose the vote at the UN Security Council. So through internal decisions, finally it has just made an abstention. But this shows how still on critical issues, in times of crisis, of course, because when you have the time to negotiate, compromise, consensus, it's completely different. But it reminded, in a way, much less critical what happened in Iraq. So Germany was out. It reflects the state of EU defense, also in terms of military capabilities. The EU countries, France and the UK, could not afford on their own this intervention. That's also why it led, in a way, to the lead from behind of the United States. Because without the United States, in terms of military capabilities, it would not have been possible. So now, after the Libyan intervention, there are discussions within the EU now on making further progress on military capabilities, to make more coordination of what are the strengths of the military instruments of the countries, to make sure that we do not duplicate helicopters, etc., but they are complementary. And to do this, and this was one of the messages in my presentation, what we need is ad hoc cooperation. Ad hoc cooperation, such as, for instance, I think it's now 1 year ago, France and Britain concluded together a bilateral agreement on nuclear armament. In the future, they're going to take care of their nuclear armament, equipment, exercise, etc., all together. It is not the EU itself, the EU 27, but this is helpful for Europe, so at the end for the European Union. So if you can make progress with some countries, you're already making good progress for the European Union. This is something I think important. And finally, it was a lesson for the fact that in terms of security and defense intervention in the future, anything that European countries will want to do will be through NATO. There is no such alternative. And then we can discuss, if you want, the lessons for the Syrian crisis, and how much what happened in Libya has been an obstacle for making progress on the Syrian front.
On the topic of expansion, I was curious if you could talk about the idea of the European Union becoming too large, and if it possibly shouldn't expand too much more, and if we should be including the ideas of including Turkey, and then if we include Turkey, then what other countries do you start accepting, and then do you go through all of the Middle East? Do you start accepting North African countries? And then if you're already in North Africa, do you go all the way through? And where does it end? Or should it even end, and should we just use this to kind of go to the idea of a world state?
No, it cannot be a never-ending story. You have to, if you want to keep it as also a political union, you need to have a coherence. So that means that once we will have to fix the ultimate borders of the EU, which is very, very, very problematic, because the leverage that the EU is using in its neighborhood mainly is integration. The EU is a soft power, mainly using money in the past to support its power. Today it doesn't have much money, so what can it do is open its market, open its political cycle to integrate these countries, or at least partially. So so concluding free trade agreements, deep and comprehensive free trade agreements with Georgia, with Ukraine, etc. Making mobility partnerships for migration, visa facilitation, etc. But then at a moment, these countries will ask, okay, we've been all this, we've gone through all these integration tools that you've been proposing, etc. We've made all the progress now. We would like to come and enter the EU. There is one thing in the treaties themselves. Any EU countries must be on the European continent. So you have the geography in your mind. That means that some countries could never enter the EU. Maghreb countries, in the Middle East, etc. But you have Ukraine, Georgia, etc., Armenia, even Azerbaijan. Okay. Personally, it's really my personal opinion. I don't think that the EU should integrate these countries. It should find new ways of cooperation with these countries once it has really deepened its internal integration, its internal EU project. What that means? That means that we would have in the future a lot of concentric cycles, like very, very different cycles. I'm not sure that the EU 27 countries will be able to integrate in the future. So we might think that we would have again some inner cycles within the EU, not with all these 27. Then you could think the EU 27, that you could imagine, or 27 who would be 33, because the Balkans, I'm sure, one day will be part of the EU. Serbia, Bosnia, Albania, Kosovo, Montenegro, Serbia. It's already 6. And I might forget others. So 27 plus 6 is 33. And then you might have other countries, and then other countries, etc. And you will need a new way to... It cannot... All this cooperation, if you want it to work, having a big European region as a pole of governance in international affairs, etc., it cannot be Eurocentric. It must be shared by these neighbors, other countries, as also their own thing. But then it's not clear where Turkey would stand, because Turkey would never accept to be on the same foot as countries as Armenia or countries like that. So it's a very difficult thing. But what you can imagine is if you really integrate on core issues amongst a few countries, you have countries that are most interested by the internal market. If you look at the United Kingdom, concretely, they are mainly interested by the internal market, the financial services, all the economic area, mainly. It's more complex, but mainly. So if you integrate deeper in other areas, such as migration, for instance, the Schengen area, etc., they will not be part of it. But they will be part of the European Union. But you can imagine, if you are able to integrate more within this core group of countries, you can imagine that countries like Turkey and others might enter, but not this inner cycle, I would say. A noyau, comment can I say that? A noyau? A core.
I think it was in 1990s, Morocco applied for EU membership, and it was directly rejected because it was non-European. But Turkey is also geographically European, so there is no doubt about it. And
Iceland then, like this, or I mean, the UK is, I mean, they're an island, but we're fine with that. So
Yeah, because it's on the European country.
Yeah, they are not continental countries, but they are thought to belong to the European culture.
Yeah.
And I think regarding the Turkey's EU membership, I think yeah, the implicit reasons are the ones that you told, the absorption capacity of the European Union. But the main political reason is the Cyprus problem. And due to the Cyprus problem, we have, I think, around 11 chapters, 13 chapters suspended just because of the Cyprus problem, and 3 chapters are suspended because of the attitude of the France, because France and especially Sarkozy think that if those chapters, one of them is the economic and political union, and Turkey is ready in all aspects for the negotiation in this chapter, but Sarkozy thinks that if those chapters are open to negotiation, will directly lead to EU membership. So it's just the attitude of the France, not anything related to Turkey.
No, but we must not forget that in all this process, it is very important that Turkey makes progress on a wide range of issues as well. Huh? And I'm sure that if we would not stand on these purely political positions, that would allow Turkey to make more progress. But there are still, I mean, you're not opening chapters like this and ending them like that. Huh? Even if the member states are open to this process, it's a very, very difficult process that takes years and years for the partner to adapt, to implement what is called the acquis communautaire. It's thousands, tens of thousands laws, regulations, directives, etc.
It's a slight change of topic, but my question is on energy policy, actually. You said that by 2050, I think, EU dependence on foreign supplies, energy supplies will approach 80 or 90%, I can't remember. And you said that there's a need for a comprehensive strategy to address that. To my knowledge, though, there is a strategy, the 2020 strategy that addresses renewable energy and energy efficiency. It's based on the directives 2006, 31, and 32, I think, that calls for national action plans to address renewable energy and energy efficiency. Is this strategy insufficient in your opinion? And if so, what would you recommend the EU does after 2020 to address the...
The figures that I mentioned was for 2030, because after that, at least the dependency will not decrease, but the consumption will decrease quite a lot for fossil fuels, because you know that the EU is engaging in a transition towards a low-carbon economy. It has the objective to decrease CO2 emissions by 80% to 95% by 2050. And for this to occur, the EU wants to have a completely decarbonized energy system. That means that to produce electricity everywhere in the EU, to transport it, to distribute it, to consume it, etc., it will be carbon neutral. So it's a drastic revolution. It's a third new green revolution, let's say. And the first step, major one, which has been adopted is this, what you've mentioned, the EU 2020 by 2020. So 20% of renewable, 20% of energy efficiency, and 20% less CO2 emissions. It's a major process. It was a huge challenge. You know it better than me how difficult it is to get an agreement in the United States on these issues. And there we had 27 national countries which agreed to make this effort. But this effort has been spread between the countries. It's not, they all not have to make 20-20-20. Some have to make 7% more, while others 30% more, etc. With this, you will never achieve
the main objective of decarbonization, a real transition to a low-carbon economy. So, of course, they are insufficient in this regard if you're looking ahead. But as a first basis, it's a major improvement, a major achievement. And we already know that the 20% of CO2 emissions will be achieved, the 20% of renewable will be achieved, and the main problem is with energy efficiency. Energy efficiency, which means that on the one hand, you use less energy to produce a good, and on the other hand, you use less energy in general in your consumption, etc. Everyone says, all actors internationally, that it's the core issue for energy and climate in the future. But there is a big gap between the expectations and the achievement. For this, we have about that at current pace of development, we will achieve 10% only in 2020. And why that? Because mainly it costs money. You have very little return of investment. The return of investment is only for the consumer. But for the industry, which has to invest, for instance, is refurbishing completely these old buildings, or to install smart metering, etc., this is very costly. So we have to invest a lot of money in this field.
So my question is related to your idea of having EU delegates to different countries. And I think that is really interesting when you think about bilateral relationships. But my question is regarding how that would work in international organizations. If you take, UN or UNESCO, for example, where you have several international European delegates that kind of form a block when voting, how would that relate to the power that the West in general has now that we're having so many other nations and really kind of a democratic system internationally when voting within these international? So would they have one vote or multiple votes?
Right, that it has EU delegates, which is already a revolution as such. Huh? You have real EU ambassadors now, which was not thinkable in the past. But this is on a bilateral basis. On international governance, global organizations or multilateral or regional organizations, there is only one where the EU is on its own a member acting for the member states, etc. It's WTO. There, it's an exclusive competence of the European Union, so it's mainly the European Commission which represents the EU member states, negotiate the deals, etc. But it does it for the member states. Huh? Then, in others organizations, you have a kind of construction, an hybrid construction, where both the EU and the member states are represented. They have delegates. Why? It is because in all the international organizations, if you want to see who will represent who, you look at the internal competence. If it's a shared competence between the EU and the member states, then they will have to share their representation in the international organization. But even if it's a shared competence, nothing is against the member states to decide, no problem, that will be the European Commission or the High Representative who will represent us. And this is something which is happening progressively. For instance, recently the EU has decided to negotiate what is called the Southern Corridor to bring energy from the Caspian. This is a purely issue of national sovereignty. The EU is not competent to do it. But the member states, amongst them, have thought and decided that it would be more convenient if it's the European Union itself which negotiates a framework agreement, a big agreement, with Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan for the supply of gas. And in that case, it will be the Commission who will represent the EU abroad. But then, once it has concluded the agreement, it comes back in Brussels and it shows the agreement to the member states, and they then have to agree or not. In other organizations, or not organizations, let's talk about the G20. Within the G20, what you find is that you have even different institutions represented. So you have member states, less and less, and you have EU institutions. So you have le Président Barroso, who's representing the Commission, and you have Van Rompuy, who's representing the Council of the European Union, the European Council, so the EU countries themselves. And finally, in general, in the major institutions, such as the UN, the member states are not ready to give up their right and their position. And the main argument they use is also the fact that if we touch on it to allow a European Union representation, that would mean that you have to completely revise the way that this or that international organization is organized. That means, for instance, you touch at the Security Council that you need to discuss India, Brazil, South Africa, etc., etc. So what has been thought is that in parallel, EU position would be progressively much more represented. And for instance, in the United Nations, there has been a major progress made by the EU, is that it has more than an observatory status. It's a half between the state and the purely observator. So it can not make proposal on its own, but it can take the floor, it can ask for reports, etc., etc. So it has, for the first time, a new status. But once it has done it, many countries has opposed it at the beginning, saying that they would fear that their regional organization to which they belong to, let's say for instance ASEAN, would ask the same kind of status, while the constitutive members are completely opposed to that. So it's a big challenge ahead. I think that the High Representative, but also the President of the European Union, Van Rompuy, can bring much more progress to have at least a European face, a European interlocutor, if not a common voice.
I just wanted a little bit of explanation on your statement that it's impossible to swim alone in seas too vast for individual states.
You cannot compare now. I mean, there is one such a big country within the EU, and I dare saying it in Paris, it's Germany. But Germany to exist, and Germany is mainly an economic power, Germany to exist on the international stage, without the European Union, it is nothing. Its main strength, it's the internal market. So the economic links, it has an advantage within the European Union. Except Germany, all the other countries. I was in London last week. It's discussing Global 2030, what are the trends and implications for the EU. And the Brits were very, very pessimistic about their own, so they are continuing such a kind of rhetoric, especially in the field of common foreign and security policy. But vis-à-vis all other issues, they are not trying to swim alone, I would say. Today, what we see is that there is no more one hegemonic power. In certain fields maybe, but on many others, no. So that means that we have a lot of middle-range powers. And when you look at these powers, the EU is a middle-range power. The EU is not a big global power, I would say. It's a middle-range power, a regional power, which has a stake on the global governance, on global issues, etc. And so member states will have to face this reality. I don't see, but then there is all the political constraints internally, because people, the citizens, if you look at the debate in France, the electoral debate,
many people do not feel protected by the European Union. On the contrary, they would feel much more protected by their own national borders, country, president, etc. So if you have both the political leaders and the citizens who do not dare to try common collective action, it's very difficult. But what we see is that progressively the impact, the global context, it will not be a choice anymore. You will have to act collectively at the EU level on many.
On that point, yeah, there's a lot of argument at the moment, as you know very well, that the EU began as the European community in functionalist terms. The whole question of integration, increasing integration, was in terms of overflow onto other issues. That it was an incrementalist position started by the founders. And that actually what the sovereign debt crisis with the relative decline of the Northwest indicates, and obviously we're talking about many years, we're not just simply talking about a punctual moment, but it would seem like the sovereign debt crisis 2009-2010 reveals something as a historical sign with regard to the gridlock also in the US politically, that this functionalist model no longer operates. Now, you've talked a great deal when you've been able to answer positively quite skeptical questions to you. You've said this will take time. You've in many ways borrowed the language of functionalism. But at another level, and I know well from you because I know you, you're actually very concerned about political vision. You are in many ways a constructivist, and you are very concerned that a vision for the European Union is constructed, and maybe that vision is one of federation of nation states. It seems to me that there are two levels of analysis and prescription there that don't quite meet at the same level, and it would seem rather important if you're arguing that the European Union needs an integrated foreign policy, must become, be it in a new way, of a political power, that it clearly situates itself within the geopolitics you're describing as a normative political power. Now the question back to you is, okay, but if it can't do that in a functionalist way because that's just going to be too slow, it's got to propose a vision of itself in a more and more complicated set of power relations. What is that vision? Because that vision can no longer simply be normative civil power. It's got to be something else. Now, you know the dossiers very well. I would simply ask you, what do you think that vision could become so we can begin to align functionalism and something like the construction of a political vision?
If I had the answer. No, I would say that the EU has made progress in times of crisis, and we had a crisis now, but with a certain vision, even if it was in time of crisis. Today, I agree, there is no such a vision. So the deal we are doing, for instance, if you look at all the measures that have been adopted for in terms of budget austerity, the fiscal pact, etc., so bringing finally the economic governance for the European Union, mainly the European Economic and Monetary Union. These are pragmatic. These are not reflecting at all the community method, the spirit of shared sovereignty. There is a lot of problems of competence. Concretely, the countries ask the Commission to do some bad work, controlling, sanctioning, etc., but without giving it the competence. So it shows you how this deal has been built in a way. So it's purely intergovernmental. And now today, when you discuss it with EU leaders, etc., they will tell you, we don't care about community method, intergovernmental. This is something from the past. Now we have a union method. And what is the union method? It's just providing answers where there is problem. And this is something by President Sarkozy, Angela Merkel. It will not work concretely. You will fix some little things and then you will see that there are other holes and gaps, etc., etc. So the main message is to go back to the community method. But for this to happen, what you need is at least the people who are dealing with the community method to believe in it. And at the moment, there is a certain pessimism. If you look at the EU institutions themselves, except the European Parliament, which gained a lot of power, so you can imagine that it can bring a more politicized vision to the European Union. The European Commission itself is very prudent, cautious in implementing the community method, in saying that there is no alternative in so many fields than the community method, which has proved its success on many, many different policies. So this is problematic. At the moment, there is no political vision from EU member states. From the left to the right. We could imagine, because Europe is very much right-wing liberal at the moment, if you look at the Council, the countries where they are, but there are some progressively more social democrat countries, but in the vision that they bring, there is not much change. So something, again, I think it will evolve by necessity. And what could change this vision, the way that it is organized at the moment, is if we politicize a little bit more the European Union as an entity. And for this, what we need is in 2014, we will have the new election of, it will be the new cycle for the European Union. We will have a new parliament, a new European Commission, and a new budget, and a new. So far, the President of the European Commission is just selected by the heads of states and governments at the majority. The President of the European Union, Van Rompuy, as well. So what we need is an election, and we are, Pascal Lamy, etc., at Notre Europe, we are promoting this. We ask for an election, a direct election of the President of the European Commission and of the President of the European Union. That you would have pan-European candidates, left, right, environmental, and many others, pirates, who would then discuss European issues at national level, but this would completely change. And we might see, because if you look at France, at the end, you have many, many, many parties which believe in Europe, from the left to the right. But once it is articulated into a national elections with national candidates only, no one dares saying that Europe is a good thing, because it's not, you do not sell it easily. So the politicizing the European Union, I think, would be an important thing. And then, again, it's what we miss, it's differentiated integration. Integrating on certain issues amongst just a few countries. This has worked in the past for Schengen. The fact that you can move freely from Belgium to France to Germany, etc., was adopted just among 17 countries together. And then it has been reintegrated within the EU. The euro you have in your pocket, and then you can pay in many, many different countries, again, it has been adopted just amongst a few countries. And it is expanding to other countries. The Commission itself, at the moment, will never make the proposal on its own for differentiated integration. It will always try to find a consensus on within 27 countries. It is fine, because it's its role, it represents the general interest of the European Union, but once it doesn't really work, it has to push more for such issues to work. And it can work on energy, it can work on cultural issues, and on defense, so important issues. And then if it shows that it is working, that it has a vision, that it has a leadership, others can join and kill it. Thank you.